Up now, schedule-wise, for the last keynote, the closing keynote, with Dr. Harry Hellenbrand, who is the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Cal State Northridge. And Harry and I were introduced by a mutual friend, Dean of the library at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where I believe that was Harry's prior position. And I was going up there on a regular basis. I had been briefing students on Dr. Deming's ideas, and then the faculty and staff got excited, and so I was going up there regularly working with the library staff. And then at one point, a guy says, there's a great guy who just left here to go to CSUN. You ought to get a hold of him. I said, who is he? So Harry Hellenbrand. So I gave him his number, and I called him up. And he says, yeah, I'm just here. Yep, I know Hiram, but I'm in the midst of unpacking. Can we talk at a later date? And I said, sure. And that later date was, gosh, 7 or 8 years later, unfortunately. But in between, when we were looking at bringing the conference to CSUN, had the thought of doing a Google search for CSUN Deming, and up pops a TED Talk video with our keynote speaker, Harry, with, I believe, Deming's name in the title. I thought, I know that guy. So we got it. So I thought, how could we miss having? We watched the video, and it was profound. His understanding was great. And then through several connections, had a chance to meet Harry for the first time last summer. And I walked in, and he was deeply interested in Deming's ideas. So I said, so was it a 4-day seminar, once, twice, 3 times, 4 times? He says, no. I said, I just started reading books on management theory, and his stuff just stood out. And I said, most people have a hard time discerning Deming's work from everything else. He says, no, it stood out. And I thought, boy, you're the guy we wanted Sunday morning as our keynote speaker. So here he is, Dr. Harry Hellenbrand.
I think I got this. First, let's check, is this mic working? Let me give a couple comments at the start. My view of Deming and how I'm going to speak to him today is as what I call a high mid-level manager. And it's not going to be that helpful for in the classroom itself, but I think my reflections speak to general things about how what the state of education and higher education is in the United States today. And I got to Deming a number of years ago when I was reading books on management change and higher education and working through Milton Friedman on school choice and Clay Christensen on disruptive innovation, and found myself dissatisfied with market and competitive solutions to improvement in schools. So I began working a little bit further down the line and came to Deming. And I'm really not going to rehearse Deming's 14 points or his assessment cycles or things like that. I'm going to just pull out some basic ideas, do an overview or narrative of the state of higher education in the U.S. today, and come up with some general solutions that I think we need to look at. And I'm going to pick some major values at the start that I think if you have California or any state in mind, and you have in mind the world of MOOCs and these other things that I heard people talking about, you'll get a sense at the start why I picked these values to begin with. Constancy. An enterprise must not be wedded to the specifications of a particular product, but it also cannot do everything. The leader needs to be a strategic thinker. A car company responds to environmental conditions, family structure, and materials, as well as torque and performance. Deming imagines business as a thoughtful evolution, not a series of disruptions. The market, if well understood, solidifies long-term relationships between the maker and the buyer through quality and consistency. It is not a contest, the market, for extracting cash from exchange to catapult us into a new business and a new paradigm. Consistency. Consistency of purpose must be matched by consistent execution. To raise quality and reduce variation, an enterprise should narrow its suppliers if it can. A single source that is shipped from one place is best. The clearest specifications and the most precise technology cannot suppress the subtle differences that different suppliers inadvertently introduce into the system. System. Production is a system, an intermeshing of stages. Optimization in a part does not solve, indeed can cause, the misalignment of the whole. We must distinguish intrinsic from extrinsic causes of variation and do our best to reduce fluctuations in those effects caused by the system itself. Cooperation. A system works best when all members cooperate. Leadership sets the tone. If leadership ranks employees or groups by outputs for bonuses, they invite invidiousness and hoarding information, as our previous panel said. In a wartime economy, competitors cooperate for the general welfare. Well, our rhetoric implies now that we are at an economic and educational war with the world because of globalism. But have we responded as a nation or a series of market and market competitors? Leadership. The leader should inspire employees to appreciate workmanship and quality in a society that rewards quick exchange and liquidity. A leader also must develop talent, not just rank it. A leader must be wise enough to know whether to attribute divergence to the system or the individual. So how does our greater educational system fare against these Deming ideas? Well, constancy of purpose is not an attribute of public education in the United States. In an effort to win prestige, advocates have presented teaching and the teaching of teaching as respectively an applied science and as a science. Let's bracket that. I can come back to that at the end, but Diane Ravitch has written a lot about that. This is very unfortunate. The approach typically justifies revolutions in pedagogy, quote, scientifically. When institutional purpose and process shifts frequently, we institutionalize fads, and it is hard for teachers to concentrate on the student before him or her. We underestimate the cost of immense disruption, and we oversell the benefit. Such change usually mistakenly expands an effective strategy for some students at some times, phonics, whole language, manipulables, project-based learning, inclusion, immersion, into a comprehensive philosophy of teaching. As a result, teacher candidates and teachers are pulled one way and then another. Parents who learned an old way are alienated from their children's new way of learning, and students try to understand their world while the maps of cognition and learning change without a common key. Higher education has been troubled by inconsistency of another kind. I'd say an inconsistency of mission, primarily. The distinct roles of the community colleges, state universities, and research universities stabilize missions, functions, and physical plant in documents like the California Master Plan in the late 1950s, and many of you are familiar with that. It is the blueprint for segmental differentiation. However, think of what has happened since then. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. College access expanded in the 60s and 70s, while the conditions of public schools worsened. As a result, in California, well over 50% of the students who graduated high school and passed the college qualifying A through G curriculum needed remediation in the state universities and the University of California in the 60s and 70s. The proportion of community college students who needed such remediation who graduated high schools exceeded 80% of those who needed remediation. And these reflect national averages. Essentially, secondary and post-secondary education merged without planning to merge. Think too of what has happened financially. Internal pressures for more funding combined with external pressures from our regions has distended universities and diluted their purpose. The greater the prestige and added income for research, the wider the flight of tenure-track faculty from teaching. The drive for reputation and philanthropy prompted the development of entertainment complexes and sports arenas, even at state universities. At most state universities, these auxiliaries actually tap more resources than they replenish. Is a university, or is it an entertainment complex and a sports complex? At the primary and secondary school levels, institutional inconstancy is compounded by turnover in personnel. This is just national averages. Imagine how much it's worse in LA. After 4 years, 40% of teachers, principals, and superintendents have moved on. Roughly 21% of teachers will experience the same regime for more than 4 years. Turnover like this is complicated by the short shelf life of technology, which is deployed all the time in schools today. What are the odds that transient faculty and administrators will master an ever-changing philosophy and pedagogy embedded in an ever-changing technology? Universities suffer from serial initiatives. Rural education is the problem for which distance education is a cure. Yes, but the real problem is that demand outstrips supply on campuses and MOOCs are the answer. No, we must improve graduation rates and close the gaps in achievements among ethnic groups. No, at least we must expand access to marginally qualified students to improve equity. No, that's not it. The university must become less financially dependent on the state, but no, it should limit tuition increases. And it should not use extension to go into direct competition with state funding. Are we an independent financial institution? Are we dependent on the state? Are we face-to-face, or are we technology and distance-based? When we use technology, we're dealing with distant populations, or we're dealing with populations in our own neighborhood. What is our purpose? How easily we forget that large urban districts like LAUSD have over 500 schools, elementary schools, and over 200 high schools. Let me repeat that again and put it in terms of the flow of work and the flow of people into these schools. How easily we forget that large urban districts like LAUSD have over 500 elementary schools and over 200 high schools. In turn, they feed into 9 local community colleges and 5 CSUs, as well as 2 nearby UCs. Over half of these students move from one school to another, excluding the hops from one level to the next. Imagine that as a supply chain. You have 500 elementary schools, 200 high schools, 9 community colleges, 5 CSUs, and 2 UCs. That's one hell of a supply chain as you move students through it. In other words, we compound the individual and ethnic diversity of students, the supply, with a bewildering array of pedagogies, philosophies, and administrative styles, the treatment, in dozens of institutions, the sites and sources. There is minimal consistency in the preparation of students as they enter distinct stages in the system like junior high school, and post-secondary. This disarray of sites and treatments requires conformity to standards for coherence. Such conformity thrives, though, on penetrating explanation and teacher preparation programs, coupled with relevant on-site professional development for new teachers. But there is little evidence that teacher preparation programs in public schools have developed scalable models for cooperative nurturing of teacher talent with feedback loops to preparatory programs. That's not to say that there are not some nationally, but if you follow the Carnegie Corporation, the Bush Foundation, the Gates Foundation, any of these groups that have worked on this, teacher preparation and the linkage between the universities and the schools has been a dastardly problem for decades at this stage. System. Perhaps our greatest problem is our misapprehension of system. No state in the United States has a true system of education. Rather, we have segments, each with subsections that are divided further. The employees do not commingle and coordinate from segment to segment regularly. Across subsections, faculty might be required to teach to the same standard due to accreditation, within the same course description. But how often do faculty norm grading on a campus, let alone a system or across systems, share problems and solutions, and give meaningful feedback to the segment above or below? The answer to that is they don't, and we don't. For instance, in California, the high school exit exam has no relation to entry for college. The high school exit exam, the CASE, measures success in English up to the 8th grade level, success in English up to the 8th grade level, and success in math up to the 10th grade level. Over 30% of the students who today take the college preparatory curriculum in the schools need remediation in the CSU. So 30% of the students who pass the A through G qualifying exam curriculum today still need remediation in the CSU. 80% of high school graduates go through remediation in the community colleges, as I said before. With few exceptions, feedback is not given to high schools and community colleges about how their students fare in public four-year colleges. In other words, if you're working at a community college, if you're working in a high school, if you're working in a junior high school, you will get virtually no information back to you from the universities about how your students are doing, how they're doing in particular courses, how students who go through various tracks are performing in the university. None. There is no feedback loop at all. It's not to say they've not been gerrymandered locally, but there's no such thing on the state as a whole. Indeed, California, in its wisdom 2 years ago, abolished the CPEC, the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, which was really the only group in the state that accumulated data across these systems. Time after time, we mistakenly attribute flaws to people rather than the system and leaders. And Andrea talked about this the other day. For example, there are over 2 million elementary and secondary school teachers in America. Systems hire annually nearly 250,000 new teachers at a level of pay for office clerical employees. When I looked at some census numbers a couple years ago, and I'm exaggerating the scale a little bit, but not a lot, I saw on the average salaries of people who are 10 years out, the lowest paid person on that scale for full-time work tended to be a preschool teacher. The highest paid person on that scale tended to be a computer engineer. Well, that tells you where our values are. If we're expecting to produce good students in the United States and we're paying elementary and preschool teachers next to nothing, then what we're going to get is next to nothing in return. We suffer the debilitating illusion that entities like Teach for America will galvanize the best and brightest to join a crusade against ignorance in the inner cities. We seem to believe that we could easily identify the bad teachers, weed them out, so in Teach for America, and solve quality teacher by teacher. That's our assessment plan. But Teach for America provides perhaps 6,000 new teachers each year, and they stay briefly in the game because they go on to that economic challenge, economic ladder that I mentioned before. The relatively low pay and high disempowerment of teachers are not effective incentives for people to stay once the glow of service has dulled. Consequently, we get teachers with modest academic skills. We must adjust that to the system. We have to structure salaries and jobs that will attract knowledgeable candidates, and we need to develop ongoing support within the system that supplements teachers that we as people can afford. One classic example of that is in the next 3 to 4 years, we're going to be moving to Common Core in California and elsewhere across the United States. Speak to the teachers whom you know about how much instruction there has been on adopting the Common Core curriculum. And speak to the universities to get a sense of how much work has been done in the universities to work on Common Core with the schools. The answer will be either 0 or 1 or 2 on a scale to 10. Assessment. It will be difficult to overcome the regime of testing individuals to determine quality in education. We have 100 years of testing of individuals, a strong industry and culture in the United States. We have a long history of such testing in schools and a cultural belief in the power of the individual. But if we were to achieve quality through transformation, then academic leaders need a different psychology. The greater the effect of teaching on the immediate fate of teachers and students, the more likely the test will distort behavior. Teachers and students will concentrate on subjects that indices measure. We'd be far better off doing assessments of the system and doing that more efficiently than the testing that we're doing of individuals right now. What lessons can we draw from this? It's a pretty dire picture and a dour picture, but there are many things that can be done, and a lot of it depends on leadership. The biggest problem in education in California and the other states today is leadership. It's not teacher quality, it's not stupid students, it's leadership. Generally, leaders confront scarcity of money, qualified personnel, etc., but trying to maximize the share of money for one's own sector. Quality, the argument goes, requires more resources. Improving quality with fewer resources amounts to forfeiture of those resources. The state and many states lack leaders who can develop an educational plan that can be implemented collaboratively and constructively eliminate redundancy and waste. These leaders need to gather at the table, and how rarely they do. I've been watching this for years in California, and I've seen very few instances where the segments have come together and worked together to solve problems. They must reach an ethical compact with their states. Educational leaders must accept that state subsidies will not increase. I can come back to that a little bit later on if you want to. They must look within, as must the unions. Together they must repair those joints in the structure that delay graduation and moral quality, and many of us know what those joints are. Overall cost per graduate should then go down, and reputation for quality should attract non-residents with higher tuition. To the extent that employees generate resources through quality, they earn a right to those resources. They become a new kind of shareholder. And I can talk about that later on, but our economic model for running universities and community colleges is broken. We really need a new one, because the current paradigm of relying on the state to supply more money is not going to work, and we have to get rid of that paradigm. Leadership must promote constant purpose with consistent methods. This is far easier said than done. With over 84 million Americans in some form of education, the temptation to bring new products to market is overwhelming. The pressure to publish in educational colleges mounts annually, as is the pressure on these colleges to, quote, make a difference for the sake of branding. The cyclone that sweeps education into the electoral fury of red versus blue ravages the plains of this country every 2 years. The turbulence of the economy increases as technology facilitates and amplifies split-second movements of capital. Educators today face a perfect storm. They are pummeled by vectors heaving change at them. Common Core is marketed as a historical disruption because of the specificity of its references to content and the universal participation of students in it. In spirit, though, it is a return to deep content, trumping nonverbal experience. It can work if teachers are supported and schools are equitable. However, neither is the case now. And because neither is the case now, we can expect Common Core to go the way of everything else, become another fad that will rise and die because we haven't addressed the systemic problems that motivate these new fads. James Conant, many years ago, thought that the large comprehensive high school could reduce variation in learning and was the main answer to problems in inner-city America. Size also made it practical to offer tracks of classes about vocations and life skills that suited students who merely endured academics. With the proliferation of tracks in the school, the variety of student competence, the vast number of feeder schools that provided students to these schools, and the array of teacher preparation programs that situated their teachers in these schools, basically made coordination and coherence nearly impossible. Consider this as an alternative, and this is going back to what John Goodlad and others proposed decades ago. We reduced large high schools and linked them strictly to families of feeder schools, families of feeder elementary schools, and feeder junior high schools. We tightly sequenced curriculum, methods, and professional development in these schools and their preparation programs. So we tied together these tracks across these schools vertically and horizontally. We mandate that 5% of everyone's budget must be spent on common problems and solutions as defined by local cross-institutional research teams. Right now, the research that's done in colleges of education usually bears no relationship to the pressing needs in the schools around them, and the research that's done by districts reflects no interest in the findings of the faculty who are working in nearby universities. And as much as possible, we restrict internships and hiring in each cluster to a few nearby teacher preparation programs. In other words, the thinking is, in a place like Los Angeles, that just as an example, Dominguez Hills, the high schools around Dominguez Hills are served best by finding the, quote, best quality teachers across the LA basin. Well, they could be coming from 25 to 30 preparation programs. Why not pull those teachers primarily from Dominguez Hills and from the other universities nearby it, cut down the number of suppliers, improve the consistency between the suppliers and the school, and have feedback loops that are actually manageable. This approach limits the market, rejects economies of scale, and reins in both this department autonomy and faculty academic freedom. Instead, it structures cooperative culture. It calls for a radical transformation in organization. And I would argue in our inner cities, until we have such a radical transformation, the disasters that we see today will continue. You look at Santa Ana, you look at Long Beach, you look at Provo, Utah, you look at a variety of places that are making changes, San Diego, and many of them are following a cluster model like this. We have a family of schools that work together because what you need is consistency and constancy in teacher preparation, curriculum development, and feedback. You need to look at it as if it is a production system because that's what it is. Public education must be reconstructed as a true system. In California, it is a decayed tenement of 4 or 5 tiers. The stairs from one floor to the next end well short of the next level. The students see this makeshift bridge as a leap. The higher institutions interpret it as, quote, remediation. Around this stairwell cluster apartments. There are the academic departments, and universities in particular. Behind these doors are the disciplines. They do not share a common tongue and a common culture. They run away from general education. Go to any university in California at the state university level or the EC level and find out how many of the faculty who are full-time and tenure track are actually teaching general education classes, and you'll see what I mean. Go to the community colleges and find out how many of those faculty are teaching those courses, and you'll see something less perverse, but it's still damnable. The building, the tenement that I referred to, cannot become a system until the tenants within it, the faculty and administrators, become a community. Leadership must make that very clear. That will be very difficult given faculty's neglect of students' overall experience, the decentralized structure of most universities that works to the benefit of many local administrators, and the kabuki negotiations between higher education and unions. Efforts to improve college preparation and on the far end job relatedness and readiness exist at most universities, but they are not scaled because they do not yield dollars and cash immediately. We have to find a way to reward those places that are putting investments in education, because without investments in it, we're not going to get changes made for the future. We have to redo completely how we frame and conduct assessment. Right now, as I said before, it mainly focuses on individual achievement. It charts student performance and provides a basis for evaluating ranking K-12 teachers in schools. In higher education, faculty set student learning objectives and accrue data, major by major, as accreditation suggests and mandates. Rarely is this assessment done diagnostically to improve, if not the overall system of education, then connecting parts within it. We can perfect the second-year retention rate within CSU or any campus. But how do we know that the resources would not be better spent upstream? So we could be improving the math instruction at Cal State Northridge for, quote, remedial students. But all the evidence suggests to us these days that we should really be working at the 4th grade level. And are we doing that? And if we are not doing that, what does that tell us about our understanding of how a system works or doesn't work? Clearly, with graduation rates from high school, community college, and colleges so low, we are suffering from a deep systemic flaw. Were this flaw a cancer, there would be a national health initiative to determine etiology and cure. Arguably, you could say that in LAUSD, you have a 31% fatality rate. 69% of the students who begin the freshman year end up graduating 4 years later on. 17% of them flunk out by that point in time and drop out. If you have a 17% death rate and a 31% disappearance rate, that's what I call a problem. And that's what I call a problem that goes to something deep and systemic. And to treat it as if it's a series of individual specific causes and flaws is really a mistake. Transformation cannot occur until we reverse the negative in the photograph. Now we focus on differentiation, rankings, parts, and individuals. They must fade to black and darkness. Leadership, consistency, system, and quality improvement must emerge. And when those values change, we can see change in the systems at large. But we need a transformation of our values to make the transformation in the systems that need to be done. Thank you. Are there any questions? Anybody want to throw mud balls?
And I've got a microphone that I can run to whoever's got a question.
Yeah.
Okay. Start in the back.
Hello, really enjoyed that talk. As a tenured professor who is very ambivalent about tenure, I wonder if you could talk a little bit. I mean, you mentioned how the departments in a university are not part of the same culture. Everyone does their own thing. You said it much more eloquently. How does the process of tenure impact that? And, you know, is it possible to change the system without changing tenure? And if not, then how do you address the legitimate concerns of faculty who feel they do need tenure in order to have some academic freedom, which I think is the only legitimate argument for tenure?
Yeah, I mean, my line on that piece is I don't think that changing tenure will accomplish much at all. I mean, effectively in higher education, we've done away with tenure these days anyway. At a school like Northridge, 50% of the teachers are part-time and temporary. Of the tenured workforce, 1/3 of them is actually tenured. 2/3 of them will be untenured at this stage. So you've got a small percentage of people who are actually tenured at universities, so state universities. And there are a large number of players. And I think ultimately it comes down to what we talked about before, which is it's not going to be an administrative shift that's going to change something like a system like this. It's going to be an acceptance of new values that people will have to internalize intrinsically. If you are hired into education and you're going to teach, and you do not understand that you have a responsibility to assess students positively and well, and a positive responsibility to work with peers cooperatively, then there's no system of institutional checks and balances that will get that done. That has to be a value that's modeled by senior people and by leadership, and it has to become a cultural expectation. I just don't think it could be forced in. And I say that because what I've just described can plague many organizations. And even before we would go to the abolishing tenure, which, as I said, I don't think would be a great idea, I would like to try first something else. Simply articulate the values and explain to people the reason why those values are meaningful. And if you do that, I'm convinced that 90% of the people will adopt them and follow them. I don't think it's the case that every professor is a renegade who wants to do his or her own thing. I think it's a failure of leadership to explain the need to work together. And until that's done well and done thoroughly, I would not advise that we eliminate things like tenure. I think that's the wrong way to go.
We've got a question from a student who traveled from southern Utah.
Hi. I'm sure that there are other people in this room who could answer this question, but I'm sure you. Here, so but and I came because my job is in government, so I'm studying more of the business side of this. But I'm also a student, and I have a child who is a student. So what do we do from our side to ensure that we have the best opportunities available to us?
I think I'd say a couple things. One, what you need to do is work with those people who are up on the panel before, the people who are working locally in schools to improve them locally. That's the first thing that I would say, because when you have a child, you want an improvement, not in 6 years, you want it tomorrow. And I'd say work with those parent groups and those effective teachers and unions to take over those schools and work locally. And then what I would do is sort of work from locally on up. Try to work with parent groups and teachers associated with linked with nearby schools and build a model from the bottom up. Because it's my experience that trying to build a model from the top down won't really work until we get leaders in those places that can articulate the right values. So while we're doing that, we have to move to make that an agenda in our political campaigns and other things, but that's a much longer task to get done.
I am an educator, and I am very concerned about the Teach for America model. I know that they're taught by Teach for America. They come in, they're brainwashed to say, oh, you're so much better than those of us that have been teaching 25, 30 years. My question to you is, how does this affect the students? Because they come in for 2 years just to pay off their big Ivy League, because they get their, if they teach 2 years, their debt is wiped out, corporate welfare. How is that affecting, because as soon as that 2 years is up, they get out, go do lawyers, go into education reform, policy, things that are really going to mess us up, in my point of view. But how is it affecting the students that come to the college level that have such transients from the Teach for America program?
Let me take that on 2 levels. First, I worked for a decade to get data out of LAUSD that was usable. And when we got the data out a couple years ago and you broke it out for teachers who were prepared to go teach in LAUSD, what you found out is that teachers who came out of subject preparation programs in public universities who were properly supported, meaning they had a mentorship program from the university and were properly sponsored in the schools, did rather well in comparison to Teach for America. In fact, they easily equaled those students' performance over a couple of years. So the first thing that I would like to get clear on that is that if the teachers are properly supported from a modest academic background, they will do well. And the long-term investment in this is significant. I guarantee you, if you would look at the dollars that go into Pell Grants, into institutional aid, into the support that goes for the Teach for America students, and you track that back closely, more money will have been spent on those students than students who go through public teacher preparation programs. So I would dispute the value economically and the claim intellectually that those teachers are uniformly better prepared. That's point number one. And point number two, I think you made it in asking the question. I think so much depends on school and district culture. And if you have incredible transients of teachers in and out of it, changing pedagogies, changing administrative styles, then you cannot develop a culture in a school. And as we saw earlier today in the panel and yesterday afternoon, so much depends upon the culture of a school. And that depends on coherence, constancy, and consistency of execution over a period of time. It's no different than a good basketball team. If you put 5 stars out there and they've never played before, they're going to be individually good, but as a team they're going to suck. And I don't think we can expect that much different from a school. If you have people who work together and they don't exactly hate one another, they'll learn how to play together and they'll do well together. I think that's just basic human common sense.
You have such a deep understanding of the current structure, and it sounds like, to me anyway, it sounds like you have a deep understanding of profound knowledge and what Dr. Deming suggested. If we're going to create a culture, and based on your understanding of the structure of the education system, what is the level that would have to be affected to have the most impact to be able to create a culture? At what level?
Yeah, I think my answer to that is double. First, that's where leadership comes in. You need people to articulate it. And then I think it goes back to what John Goodlad talked about. I've been reading him over again, which is you need simultaneous renewal. And that try to get simultaneous renewal across the whole state is impossible. To get it done across a cluster of schools is possible. So if you would work with, I'm taking Dominguez Hills again, Dominguez Hills, 5 local high schools, and 20 local junior high schools, and 50 local elementary schools, as they're done in Long Beach, I think you can make a profound change in a couple of years. Because you'll have people who share a common culture, they'll know who one another is, and you can get the job done. So I think the answer is leadership on the high level, and then simultaneous renewal on a modest level of size. That's because if you're going to be teaching Common Core, let's just say, and you're not preparing people to teach Common Core, you're not supporting them in the teaching of Common Core, then you're not doing Common Core. So it has to be a couple places at the same time, and this comes into system thinking. At this particular point in time in this math classroom, what does this teacher need to do, and what support does he or she need to get the job done? And then you trace it back to the sources, and you put the work in place to get that preparation done on time.
Another question.
Listening to conversations from the business group and the education group, it seemed that there were a recurrent theme of fostering innovation, of using the Deming system to create organizational models that supported and fostered innovation. And it seems at that point, higher education, education in general, and business come together, because those who are coming out of higher education are those going into those organizations. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about how the notion of innovation going forward is fostered in higher education and in industry, or not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to speak glibly right now for a few minutes. I'm not a big fan of disruptive innovation. And the literal model, I think it relies too highly on market competition, and it's trying to drive improvement down to the lowest level of quality to achieve the maximum level of efficiency and dollar savings. So that model I'm not really pleased with. And secondly, I look at it this way. What we have to avoid is serial dating, and that's what we've had in the schools with fads, which is Common Core doesn't work, so we'll go to whole language. That doesn't work, so we'll go to this, we'll go to the next sort of thing. So we get innovations that are superficial, but the structures never change. What we have to do is look at these relationships in our schools as if they are long-term marriages and partnerships. And the innovation actually becomes stepping aside and looking at the pattern that you're in and recognizing it as a pattern and making subtle changes to that. It's not junking the whole thing and going on to something else. I think that's where we've gotten the whole idea of innovation wrong in education these days. We just sort of pretend to throw the whole thing out, and by doing so we throw nothing out. It's really looking at the data closely, seeing when that different picture emerges, talking to people around the table so different people view the data, and then you can get innovation out of that perspective. But it's not dumping the whole way you're doing the system, because it's just pretending to make change.
We've got time for one or two more questions, if anyone else wants to step up. Oh, hey, John.
Hi, John from Florida. Is the quality of our educational system reflected in our national balance of trade?
Well, I think that the argument to that depends on who you talk to. The argument made by people who are making the economic arguments about competitive competition as a way to improve schools, the Milton Friedman folk and some of the Clayton Christensen folk would say, yes, it is reflected in our balance of trade, and it's the reason why we've lost the power of globalization, why markets have left us because we don't have prepared workers to work in those markets. I take a look at it a little bit differently. I think that the schools have enough responsibility as it is, which we're not living up to provide a good education for folk. To say that we're responsible for the balances of trade is to oversimplify the whole process, which I don't think you're saying, but other people would contend. And I think what we have to realize is that if you are going to move money offshore, not invest in schools, then you can't expect the nation that those schools are invested in to produce quality workers. So I think it's an issue of better schools, a better sense of system in those schools, and a real sense of responsibility that the answer to that is not dollar flight, but dollar investment in the United States itself.
Any more questions? Okay, I think we just experienced drink from a deep well. Thank you, Harry. Thank you very much.